Dan, what do you bring us today on Share and Tell?
Is it nice? Is it uplifting?
It is interesting, is what I will say. It stimulated
Okay.
me. It's an article from The Athletic, and it's something about sports that I had never actually considered this completely. I've written in the past about how I've believed that athletics would be more ripe for, say, gambling addictions than other places because you have people whose identity is tied up in competition, and they're going to go seeking other action, other ways to be competitive because of whatever the high of being identified as a winner is. But this article in The Athletic, it's making it seem as if there isn't much of a difference between the character traits required to be a champion and required to be an addict. That basically the same things that get you the rewards of athletic greatness, the obsessive compulsiveness of a crazy lunatic like Kobe Bryant, if not harnessed into sports, might not be able to be contained in greatness and then results in all sorts of kinds of addiction because part of your identity is being obsessive compulsive. You're sculpting a single thing to the lopsided detriment of a bunch of other things in your personality. You almost can't be as great as Kobe is unless you run every other thing off. And so I just wanted to explore with you guys the idea that an athlete or a champion specifically might be more predisposed to addictive type of things because their identity is intertwined in when I compete, I get all of the rewards. And when I get all of the rewards from high school, whenever I get in the pipeline, gymnast, tennis, wherever it is, I'm getting love, I'm getting applause, I'm getting things that feel like happiness, but they're also things that are rewarded for addictive tendencies.
Rhythmic gymnasts, even. Gold medalists like Katie Nolan.
It's me doing the ribbon, but there's
Literal
no ribbon attached.
gold medalists, rhythmic gymnast.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting examination of personality traits. You know me, I love anything that's like diving in on the humanity of the people who do the stuff, like sports that we love so much. But I also I hesitate because it feels like similar to, like almost like a cousin to this conversation we've had before about like and you've got to be an addict, a bad person. You've got to have the negative things to make great art. That's like a thing people have always been like, you have to be an asshole, or like, well, this guy beat his wife. Well, yeah, but that's why he made this great song. Greatness comes born of the negative sides of who you are as a person. These feel very closely related. Like you cannot be a champion if you aren't an addict. It makes me go,
Obsession,
Meh.
right? I mean, but it does feel about it feels like sports is a place where a vice can be recast as a virtue. Because to Katie's point, the idea of, man, I'm so obsessive, all I care about is winning. Therefore, my personality trait, which would be maladaptive, which would be something that's clinically needing to be addressed in life, finds sort of safe harbor in a hyper-competitive environment where everyone is a member of the dark triad. Shout out to the dark triad test,
Shout
which
out.
we all variously failed, incidentally. But the point about the sports
Because
of this,
we're
Dan,
losers, that's why. Winners
Not a
would
champion
win.
among us.
Winners would win the dark triad, and winners would beat us at competitive things.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. The medal stand. We didn't make the dark triad medal stand, unfortunately. But I think it's fascinating when you read this article in The Athletic, and it gets to the idea, they focus a lot on soccer and in England. And it's a lot of reporting about how all of these psychologists got hired initially to make these guys better players, better athletes, better at scoring goals and so forth. And then they realized as they were doing these jobs, like, oh, wait a minute. Like the performance improvement aspect of this is not really the job. The job here is getting these people to feel healthier mentally. Because as much as it's about, score more goals, it's about people realizing that they were crying out for help without realizing it. And it's fascinating that in 2011, England's Football Association produced a 117-page document on academy restructuring as part of its elite player performance plan. And just half a page, 7 bullet points, was devoted at all to player welfare. The rest of it was all about, like, how do we get these guys to be better? And meanwhile, these guys are, like, going out, as Dan was saying, and many, many nights, they're gambling addicts. or they are just obsessed with things that they had been given the green light to be obsessed about in their job that they then were unable to disentangle from the rest of how they use their brain.
I remember the first time I thought about this was talking to Michael Irvin, who had all of these problems off of the field, but always in the off season, always in a time where he wasn't, he was being criticized for a general recklessness and lack of discipline. And one of the things that he explained to me that I had not considered. He says, yes, I am an addictive personality. And when I'm doing football, I'm so addictive about it that my workouts are I throw up twice is when my workout ends. Not the first time I throw up, the second time. And that takes all of me during a football season. But when football is then gone, I get addicted to other things that are less good for me than this creative outlet that gives me all of the ability to have the off season and the money that gets me into the temptations. And once you start becoming the person who's getting all the rewards at every turn through childhood, that feels like some form of love, right? It may leave you empty wherever it is. I'm not even judging addicts and saying it's not always
No.
brain chemistry, but some of the things in your imprinting from your environment that always reward success when you are so obsessive that your workout's not over until you've done the second throwing up. And when you define discipline, not the way others might, but you say this is what discipline is. It isn't whether I get in a cocaine scandal at in the off season. It's the fourth quarter. I'm exhausted. I'm really tired, and the other guy across from me has been stronger than me all game. But I have the discipline to not jump on the hard count, because I'm disciplined and I'm in that kind of shape, and I have tuned myself and sculpted my skills so much that my routes have to be a half yard better than the other guys, and he's fighting that hard too, and I got to stay ahead of him for 10 years, and I'm not that fast. I'm not that physically fast. I got to stay ahead of him for 10 years. When that's the addiction and it gets rewarded, where do you put it when the season's over?
So I think this is an argument we've been making for a really long time that we still don't seem to be investing in, which is that like mental health for athletes is incredibly important. That teams provide mental health services to their athletes is like a responsibility that they have that we do not hold them to. We really don't make sure that when they are done using this person for their skills that apply to this industry that can make owners of teams money, we don't make sure that they then release them back into the world in a way that's like they are equipped to deal with the way the real world works, which is not the way that the world works when you are a successful athlete, like you said, getting rewarded with things at every turn from a very young age. And so it just feels like until we can prove or somehow tie that idea in with profit for a team, they're not going to do it. And what scares me about articles like this is it not that the article itself scares me. It's well written. It's very interesting. It's thought-provoking. But the discussion, I don't want to get to a point where people think that that part of an athlete, the addict part of an athlete, without that, if that's treated without that, they won't be great.
To your point, it's not just that owners are making a lot of money off of these athletes. Athletes themselves are incentivized to be this sort of obsessive, to blur the line between, oh, I have a personality trait, and oh, I am struggling with a disease, which is what addiction is. And for me, I there are some parts of this too that are not just about sports. Some parts of it are relatable. The idea of being a workaholic, the idea of like, the idea of my big, it's what you would say in a job interview as a fake answer.
I work too
hard. I care
put
about
too
work
much on my
too
plate.
much.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, that's seen as virtuous, and I relate to it as somebody who is perpetually thinking about work. I have content brain, as Dominique Foxworth has alleged. That's true. But I think it raises the question of what happens when you are imbalanced. And I think there are costs associated that do not get paid so clearly until the profits you're making monetarily, in terms of the ego scratching, the ego fluffing that certainly athletes, public facing people all can feel superficially, until that goes away, to Dan's point, you don't realize, oh my God, I am ill-equipped to live as a balanced person in my life.
Oh, but Pablo, I believe if we get down to the core of this, it's one of the reasons that I thought the article was so interesting. balance isn't a part of the success equation in the sports pipeline. That's not something that's being taught. That's
Right.
not something that's being practiced. That's not something that is part of the ingraining of the fabric. When Katie says that all of those pages are devoted to the business must maximize the profit of the athlete's body, and none of the pages are devoted to, and what about the athlete's mind when the body is no longer of use to us or when it's doing other things that aren't in service of us? Like, where is balance part of the measurement of success? I think it's life success as I've gotten older, but I don't think in sports they're asking you for balance unless it's balance between offense, defense, and special teams.
Or a balanced beam in gymnastics.
The point of balance, right? Like, I think, Dan, the reason why, and when I was at Sports Illustrated doing stories about like why isn't there a better mental health program in professional sports, an answer I would get back was because if you were trying to inject balance into the brains of these athletes, you might make them worse.
That's what I'm saying. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's saying you can either be an athlete or like a properly adjusted human who knows how to, like, look, everybody has the early stages of their life where their development happens, where they get their thing. They either have their nature and their nurture. Some combination of those things make them into the person that they are in their adulthood. And then in your adulthood, you can look back and solve those things, learn those lessons from your life, apply them to your life, and then continue living in a balanced way. And so I feel like the things that they needed to get them to the peak of being an athlete, if examined, will not just take out of them the things they've learned. They'll still have that knowledge. They'll still have that discipline. You don't need to continue with the thing that that's why the addiction thing, I don't know, because I feel like you can't just learn how to stop drinking so much.
What if what you're addicted to is the feel good? Like, why can't we? I understand the distinction that you're making, and it's a nuanced one, Katie, because
Between
yes,
the types, yeah.
we shouldn't be absolute about this, but if in service of the addiction you get all sorts of feel good, then how is it different from whatever it is the body responds to in liquor or drugs or heroin? If it's chasing the cheering in the middle of a stadium,
Yes.
or the life that is riches, or whatever you imagined your insecurities were in high school with boys or girls, and all of a sudden you have access to a dating pool you did. Like, why wouldn't you, or how couldn't you get addicted to a variety of things if you're not being self-aware about the things that make you who you are?
Yeah, the athletes in this story attest to that too. They talk about how nothing beats the feeling of scoring a goal in front of thousands of people, right? I mean, it's that line from an old story, an old magazine story. Joe DiMaggio is talking to Marilyn Monroe, and they're both like, Joe DiMaggio is long retired.
Such a good story. This is such a good story.
It's a haunting quote. Marilyn Monroe says after coming back from like a tour of some place where she's like adored by the crowd.
No, she's on a services ship. Like
USO. It's a USO.
It's Marilyn Monroe on a boat filled with servicemen. Yes.
Yes. And she says to Joe DiMaggio, Joe, you've never heard such cheering. And he very ruefully says, yes, I have. And it's just like, ugh. Right. Like he's feeling the part of his brain that used to light up, and it's just impotent now. And I feel like what Meadowlark Media needs to do, Dan, I'm realizing I want to be solutions oriented here, to Katie's point about like, why are we incentivizing addiction? We're mythologizing it as a function of discussing it. There needs to be a last dance, but for a guy who's super boring. A last dance for a guy, like a 10-part docuseries for a guy who gets home to put his kids to bed and is also good and is just like
for
not
a guy
interesting.
that they say, and how did that make you feel? And you're like, it was fine. I took a couple deep breaths and I realized I had to take the trash out.
The guy who says, you know what, I didn't take it personally.
No, I didn't. I forgot about it. I actually forgot even until you just brought it up just now. Wow, no grudges. It's a guy like that. We got a guy like that? Can you think of a guy like that?
Yeah.
Incredibly boring story about an asshole who wasn't that successful, but is just bland and obsessed.
Yeah, and is like a pretty good dad. Yeah, present. He's very present. Oh, he's so present.
He's the Michael Jordan of being present.